In the windswept peaks of Kazakhstan's Altai Mountains, a lieutenant known only as Lucky was about to face an impossible choice. What started as a routine peacekeeping patrol took a deadly turn when they came face to face with an enemy sniper positioned for the perfect ambush. Mara Kovalenko wasn't your typical soldier. For years, she had spent her life studying every detail others missed, known for survival that seemed impossible to everyone around her. When they encountered the Falconer preparing to destroy a humanitarian convoy, she had no idea she was about to test everything she'd learned. Kovalenko would attempt a shot that would change military doctrine forever. What began as what seemed like luck would become legend. The military world would never be the same after one impossible shot fired across 4,700 meters of mountain air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the Altai peaks like smoke from distant fires, and Lieutenant Mara Kovalenko moved through it with the silent precision of someone who had learned long ago that survival lived in the smallest details. Her boots found purchase on loose shale where others stumbled. Her breathing remained steady at altitude where others gasped. When the ancient wooden bridge spanning the Kara-Irtish Gorge groaned ominously under the weight of their patrol, she was the only one who stepped back. "Hold up," she called quietly, raising her fist. The signal rippled down the column of 8 soldiers, each laden with 70 pounds of gear and the weight of a mission that had already stretched 3 days beyond its original timeline. Sergeant Daniel Ortiz, her spotter, and the closest thing she had to a friend in the multinational peacekeeping unit, jogged up from his position at the rear. "What's got your attention, Lucky?" Mara winced at the nickname. She had tried for months to kill it, but nicknames in the military had a persistence that rivaled cockroaches. "Look at the support cables," she said, pointing to where the bridge's ancient Soviet-era engineering met the reality of high-altitude weather. "See how they're fraying where the wind hits, and that center plank? It's sagging about 2 degrees more than it should." Ortiz squinted at the bridge, then at her. "How the hell do you even notice stuff like that?" Before she could answer, the radio crackled to life. Major Anara Suleimanova's voice cut through the static with the clipped authority of someone who had been making life-and-death decisions since before most of her soldiers had learned to shave. "Echo 7, what's your status? You're 12 minutes behind schedule." "Minor route assessment, ma'am. Requesting permission to find an alternate crossing." "Negative, Echo 7. We need you at checkpoint Bravo before the weather deteriorates further. Use your best judgment, but move." Mara studied the bridge for another 30 seconds, her mind calculating load distribution, wind speed, and the precise point where the old wood would surrender to physics. Then she made her decision. "Single file, 20-meter spacing, I go first." "Lucky, that's not a request, Sergeant." She stepped onto the bridge, feeling it sway beneath her weight. Behind her, she heard Private Kowalski mutter something about Kovalenko's guardian angel working overtime again. The soldiers in her unit had developed an entire mythology around her survival instincts. They called her Lucky because she always seemed to walk away from situations that should have killed her. The collapsing tunnel during the Semai incident, the sniper who missed her by inches in the Kerchim Valley, the improvised explosive device that detonated 30 seconds after she changed routes. What they didn't see was the hours she spent each night studying topographical maps, memorizing weather patterns, and calculating risk factors that most soldiers never even considered. She resumed cleaning the bolt assembly, her movements precise and economical. Sometimes experience pays off. "Experience," Ortiz repeated. "Right. And I suppose it was experience that made you memorize the wind patterns for every valley in a 50-kilometer radius? Or practice those breathing exercises every morning when you think nobody's watching? Or test the stability of every surface before you put your full weight on it?" Mara finally looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "What's your point, Danny?" "My point is that Lucky Kovalenko is a myth, but whoever you really are, that person is something else entirely." Before she could respond, Major Suleimanova emerged from her command tent, her weathered face serious in the flickering light. She was a small, compact woman in her 50s, with the kind of presence that made generals twice her size defer to her judgment. Born and raised in these same mountains, she understood the terrain and its people better than any satellite image or blood. They didn't see her test the ground with each step, the way she listened to changes in wind direction, how she positioned herself to have multiple escape routes in any given situation. The bridge held under her weight, barely. She made it across and turned to wave the others forward when she heard it, a sharp crack like a gunshot. The center support cable snapped, and the bridge lurched sideways. "Move! Now!" she shouted. The soldiers ran. Kowalski was halfway across when the second cable gave way. The bridge twisted, planks splintering and falling into the gorge 200 feet below. Kowalski dove forward, his hands clawing for solid ground as the structure collapsed beneath him. Ortiz grabbed his gear pack and hauled him to safety just as the last of the bridge disappeared into the mist. The patrol stood in stunned silence, staring at the gap where the bridge had been moments before. "Jesus Christ, Lucky! How did you know?" whispered Corporal Singh. Mara kept her expression neutral, but inside, her mind was already cataloging the details they'd missed. The slight discoloration in the support cables where moisture had weakened the metal, the way the bridge had vibrated at a frequency that suggested structural failure was imminent, the fact that local maintenance records, which she'd memorized 3 weeks ago, showed the bridge hadn't been inspected in 18 months. "Just seems sketchy," she said with a shrug. That night, around a campfire, fueled by hexamine tablets and dried yak dung, the stories began again. Kowalski claimed she had heard voices from the mountain spirits warning her about the bridge. Singh was convinced she had some kind of supernatural sense for danger. Even the newest member of the unit, Private First Class Aisha Rahman, listened with wide eyes as the mythology of Lucky Kovalenko grew with each retelling. "I heard she once dodged an RPG by sneezing at exactly the right moment," Kowalski said, his voice hushed with reverence. "That's nothing," Singh added. "Torres told me she walked through a minefield in Uzbekistan by following some kind of pattern only she could see." Mara sat apart from the group, cleaning her rifle with the methodical precision that had become her signature. The weapon was a heavily modified Remington Model 700, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum, which she'd nicknamed Whisper, for reasons she'd never shared with anyone. Every component had been hand-selected and personally installed. The trigger was set to a precise 3-pound pull. The scope was a Schmidt & Bender with custom elevation turrets she'd machined herself. Even her ammunition was hand-loaded to tolerances that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep with envy. Ortiz moved away from the fire and settled beside her. "You know they're never going to let this go, right?" "Let them talk," Mara said without looking up from her rifle. "Keeps them entertained." "But that's not really what happened on the bridge, was it?" Mara's hands paused for just a moment in their work. "What do you mean?" "Come on, Lucky. I've been watching you for 8 months now. You don't just get lucky. You see things, calculate things. You knew that bridge was going to fail before we even got close to it." "Kovalenko," she called softly. "A word." Mara set her rifle aside and followed the major away from the fire. They walked in silence until they reached a rocky outcrop that provided a clear view of the stars wheeling overhead in the thin mountain air. "Your father would have been proud of what you did today," Suleimanova said, finally. Mara stiffened. In 8 months of service under the major's command, this was the first time her family had been mentioned. "Ma'am?" "Alexei Kovalenko, Soviet Army, 40th Brigade, one of the finest marksmen ever produced by these mountains. Suleimanova had the eye for terrain that you do, the same instinct for reading danger before it announced itself." "I wouldn't know, ma'am. He died when I was 12. Border skirmish near Zyson, officially, anyway." The major turned to study Mara's profile. "You have his hands, built for precision work, and his patience. Most soldiers want to rush into action. You understand that the best action is often the one never taken." Ma'am, I'm not sure what... Tomorrow we return to base. There's a briefing waiting for us. High priority. The kind of mission that requires someone with your particular gifts. Mara felt a familiar chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. What kind of mission? The kind where luck won't be enough. The Major's smile was thin and humorless. The kind where we'll need the real Mara Kovalenko to stand up. As they walked back to camp, Mara's mind was already working, calculating risks and possibilities, preparing for whatever challenge awaited them at base. Behind them, the soldiers' voices continued to weave the legend of Lucky Kovalenko, never suspecting that the real story was just beginning. The briefing tent smelled of strong tea, diesel fuel, and the particular staleness that came from too many nervous people breathing the same recycled air. Mara sat in the back row, her attention split between Major Suleimanova's presentation and the stack of reconnaissance photos spread across the table before them. Each image told a story of escalating violence in a region that had seen more than its share of bloodshed. Intelligence suggests coordinated paramilitary activity along the Kerchum corridor, Suleimanova said, her laser pointer highlighting a series of red dots on the topographical map. 3 separate factions, all with different territorial claims, all heavily armed, and all increasingly willing to target civilian populations to make their point. Captain Elias Rutherford, the British liaison officer responsible for convoy protection protocols, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His uniform was pressed to parade ground standards, and his mustache was trimmed with military precision, but Mara could see the tension in his shoulders. This was a man haunted by something that had gone wrong before. The convoy departs in 36 hours, Suleimanova announced. Captain Rutherford will coordinate security with local forces. Lieutenant Kovalenko will provide sniper overwatch from positions to be determined based on real-time intelligence. Ortiz raised his hand. Ma'am, what's the threat assessment? Elevated. Drone reconnaissance has identified increased movement in the mountains overlooking the route. But there's something else. The Major clicked to the next slide, showing a grainy photograph of a man in camouflage gear. We believe we're dealing with an individual known as the Falconer. A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. Even the greenest recruits had heard stories about the Falconer, a sniper so skilled that some claim he could hit a moving target at ranges that defy physics. Others insisted he was just a myth, a collection of unconfirmed kills attributed to a ghost that didn't exist. Iskander Bek, Suleimanova read, from a classified dossier. Former wildlife tracker turned mercenary after his family was killed in a misdirected airstrike 18 months ago. Confirmed kills include 3 peacekeeping officers, 2 aid workers, and at least 6 civilians who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when he was making a statement. Rutherford cleared his throat. With respect, Major, the existence of this Falconer has never been definitively proven. We could be chasing shadows while the real threat comes from conventional ambush tactics. The real threat, Suleimanova replied, her voice carrying an edge that could cut glass, is the fact that every convoy that's attempted this route in the past month has been hit by sniper fire from positions our counter-snipers can't locate. The Falconer uses trained birds of prey for reconnaissance. His intelligence network extends far beyond anything we've encountered before. Mara found herself leaning forward, studying the terrain maps with the focused intensity that earned her the lucky nickname. The route was a nightmare of narrow passes, blind corners, and elevated positions that offered countless opportunities for ambush. Worse, the prevailing winds in the area shifted constantly due to the complex topography, making accurate long-range shooting nearly impossible for conventional marksmen. The convoy departs in 36 hours, Suleimanova announced. Captain Rutherford will coordinate security with local forces. Lieutenant Kovalenko will provide sniper overwatch from positions to be determined based on real-time intelligence. Rutherford's objection was immediate and predictable. Major, with all due respect, I've reviewed Lieutenant Kovalenko's service record. Her methods are unorthodox. For an operation this critical, I'd prefer someone with more conventional training. Such as? Staff Sergeant Morrison has 15 years of experience with the British Special Air Service. Sergeant Park trained at the United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper School. Both have proven track records in similar environments. Your objection is noted, Captain, Suleimanova said with finality. But Lieutenant Kovalenko has certain advantages that make her uniquely suited for this assignment, such as an unprecedented streak of impossible luck. Rutherford's tone was just shy of insubordinate. Before Suleimanova could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. Actually, sir, I think it might be something else. All eyes turned to Private First Class Aisha Rahman, the young reconnaissance specialist who had joined our unit just 3 weeks earlier. She was barely 22, with the kind of earnest intensity that marked her either as a future leader or a future casualty, depending on how quickly she learned to navigate military politics. "Explain, Private," Rutherford said, his tone suggesting this had better be good. Aisha glanced nervously at Mara before continuing. "I've been observing Lieutenant Kovalenko's methods during training exercises, sir. She doesn't just rely on standard marksmanship principles. She calculates variables that most snipers don't even consider. Microclimate variations, geological stability, even the acoustic properties of different terrain features." "And you've observed this how, exactly?" Rutherford asked. "She spends hours studying topographical maps before each exercise, not just memorizing them, but calculating firing angles from positions that would never appear in any manual. Yesterday, I watched her test wind patterns using fabric strips at 6 different elevations, then correlate that data with historical weather patterns for the region." Mara felt a flush of embarrassment. She'd thought her preparation rituals had gone unnoticed, but apparently Aisha had been paying closer attention than she'd realized. "Furthermore," Aisha continued, gaining confidence, "her shooting scores aren't just excellent, they're mathematically impossible unless she's compensating for variables that standard ballistic computers don't account for. I've run the numbers, sir. Some of her recorded hits defied conventional physics." Rutherford turned to study Mara with new interest. "Is this true, Lieutenant?" "I do my homework," Mara replied quietly. "Nothing more than that." "Homework," Rutherford repeated. "Right. And I suppose your homework explains how you managed a kill shot at 2,847 meters in the semi-operation, despite winds that should have made accurate fire impossible." "I got lucky." "Lucky." He stood and walked to the terrain map, studying the route the convoy would take. "Tell me, Lieutenant Lucky, Kovalenko, if you were the Falconer, where would you position yourself to hit this convoy?" Morris studied the map for less than 30 seconds before pointing to a series of elevation markers. "Here, here, and here. 3 potential positions, each offering overlapping fields of fire but different escape routes. The first gives him the best shot at the lead vehicle, the second covers the center of the convoy, and the third allows him to hit the rear guard if they try to retreat." "And how would you counter those positions?" "I wouldn't." The words were out before Mara could stop them. "Excuse me?" "Those are the obvious positions, sir. Any competent counter-sniper would cover them. If the Falconer is as good as the reports suggest, he won't use them." "Then where would he be?" Mara's finger traced along the map to a series of peaks that seemed impossibly distant from the convoy route. "There. Range of 4,000 meters, maybe more. Position that conventional wisdom says is impossible to shoot from. But if he's compensating for wind shear patterns and elevation differentials that most people don't even know exist, that's a fantasy shot," Rutherford dismissively. "No one could make that kind of shot under combat conditions." "No," Mara agreed quietly. "Probably not." But even as she said it, her mind was already working out the mathematics. Wind patterns at that elevation, Coriolis effect, temperature differentials, barometric pressure variations. It would require a firing position that violated every principle of conventional sniping doctrine, but she could see it, barely, like a solution to an equation that existed at the very edge of possibility. Suleimanova watched this exchange with the focused attention of someone who recognized exactly what was happening. Sergeant Ortiz, you'll spot for Lieutenant Kovalenko. Private Rogman, you're assigned to their team for reconnaissance support. Captain Rutherford, coordinate your security arrangements with them. Major, I must protest. Protest noted and dismissed. Suleimanova's voice carried the finality of a closing door. Gentlemen, ladies, you have 34 hours to prepare. I suggest you use them wisely. As the briefing broke up, Mara lingered behind, studying the maps with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The convoy route stretched across 40 kilometers of the most dangerous terrain in Central Asia, and somewhere out there, a man with a trained falcon and a rifle was preparing to turn it into a killing field. She just had to figure out how to stop him from a position that didn't exist, using a shot that couldn't be made, before he killed 47 people who were just trying to help. The mathematics of it made her head hurt, but for the first time in months, Mara Kovalenko smiled. 200 kilometers north of the peacekeeping base, Iskander Bek crouched motionless in a hide so perfectly constructed that even thermal imaging would dismiss it as another wind-carved depression in the mountainside. His ghillie suit, woven with local vegetation and dusted with the alkaline soil of the steppes, rendered him invisible to everything except the golden eagle perched on the custom-built stand beside him. The bird was magnificent, nearly 3 feet tall with a wingspan that could eclipse a grown man's shadow. Her name was Altai, which meant golden in Kazakh, and she had been her partner for 18 months, longer than most of his human relationships had lasted, and infinitely more reliable. "Show me what moves in our valley, little sister," he whispered, fitting the tiny reconnaissance camera to her leg harness. The eagle launched herself into the morning air with the silent grace of a creature born to kill. Through the heads-up display mounted in his scope, he could see what she saw, the convoy route spread below them like a map drawn in dust and stone. He had been tracking the peacekeeping forces for 6 days now, ever since his network of informants had reported the humanitarian convoy's preparation. The irony wasn't lost on him. 47 people rushing to deliver medical supplies to villages that might not have needed help if the peacekeepers hadn't destabilized the region in the first place. His family had lived in one of those villages. His wife, Anita, his daughter, Camila, who had just turned 7 and was learning to read, and his son, Beksat, who wanted to be a wildlife tracker like his father. They had been visiting Anita's sister when the airstrike came, a precision engagement targeting suspected weapon storage, according to the official report. The weapons turned out to be agricultural supplies and winter clothing for displaced families.
"And you've observed this how, exactly?" Rutherford asked. "She spends hours studying topographical maps before each exercise, not just memorizing them, but calculating firing angles from positions that would never appear in any manual. Yesterday, I watched her test wind patterns using fabric strips at 6 different elevations, then correlate that data with historical weather patterns for the region." Mara felt a flush of embarrassment. She thought her preparation rituals had gone unnoticed, but apparently Aisha had been paying closer attention than she'd realized. "Furthermore," Aisha continued, gaining confidence, "her shooting scores aren't just excellent, they're mathematically impossible unless she's compensating for variables that standard ballistic computers don't account for. I run the numbers, sir. Some of her recorded hits defied conventional physics." Rutherford turned to study Mara with new interest. "Is this true, Lieutenant?" "I do my homework," Mara replied quietly. "Nothing more than that." "Homework," Rutherford repeated. "Right. And I suppose your homework explains how you managed to kill shot at 2,847 meters in the semi-operation, despite winds that should have made accurate fire impossible?" "I got lucky. Lucky." He stood and walked to the terrain map, studying the route the convoy would take. "Tell me, Lieutenant Lucky Kovalenko, if you were the Falconer, where would you position yourself to hit this convoy?" Mara studied the map for less than 30 seconds before pointing to a series of elevation markers. "Here, here, and here. 3 potential positions, each offering overlapping fields of fire but different escape routes. The first gives him the best shot at the lead vehicle, the second covers the center of the convoy, and the third allows him to hit the rear guard if they try to retreat. And how would you counter those positions? I wouldn't. The words were out before Mara could stop them. Excuse me? Those are the obvious positions, sir. Any competent counter-sniper would cover them. If the Falconer is as good as the reports suggest, he won't use them. Then where would he be? Mara's finger traced along the map to a series of peaks that seemed impossibly distant from the convoy route. There, range of 4,000 meters, maybe more. Position that conventional wisdom says is impossible to shoot from. But if he's compensating for wind shear patterns and elevation differentials that most people don't even know exist, that's a fantasy shot, Rutherford said dismissively. No one could make that kind of shot under combat conditions. No, Mara agreed quietly, probably not. But even as she said it, her mind was already working out the mathematics of it. Wind patterns at that elevation, Coriolis effect, temperature differentials, barometric pressure variations. It would require a firing position that violated every principle of conventional sniping doctrine, but she could see it, barely, like a solution to an equation that existed at the very edge of possibility. Suleimanova watched this exchange with the focused attention of someone who recognized exactly what was happening. Sergeant Ortiz, you'll spot for Lieutenant Kovalenko. Private Rahman, you're assigned to their team for reconnaissance support. Captain Rutherford, coordinate your security arrangements with them. Major, I must protest. Protest noted and dismissed. Suleimanova's voice carried the finality of a closing door. Gentlemen, ladies, you have 34 hours to prepare. I suggest you use them wisely. As the briefing broke up, Mara lingered behind, studying the maps with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The convoy route stretched across 40 kilometers of the most dangerous terrain in Central Asia, and somewhere out there, a man with a trained falcon and a rifle was preparing to turn it into a killing field. She just had to figure out how to stop him from a position that didn't exist, using a shot that couldn't be made before he killed 47 people who were just trying to help. The mathematics of it made her head hurt, but for the first time in months, Mara Kovalenko smiled. 200 kilometers north of the peacekeeping base, Iskandar Bek crouched motionless in a hide so perfectly constructed that even thermal imaging would dismiss it as another wind-carved depression in the mountainside. His ghillie suit, woven with local vegetation and dusted with the alkaline soil of the steppes, rendered him invisible to everything except the golden eagle perched on the custom-built stand beside him. The bird was magnificent, nearly 3 feet tall, with a wingspan that could eclipse a grown man's shadow. Her name was Altai, which meant golden in Kazakh, and she had been his partner for 18 months. Longer than most of his human relationships had lasted, and infinitely more reliable. "Show me what moves in our valley, little sister," he whispered, fitting the tiny reconnaissance camera to her leg harness. The eagle launched herself into the morning air with the silent grace of a creature born to kill. Through the heads-up display, mounted in his scope, Beck could see what she saw, the convoy route spread below them like a map drawn in dust and stone. He had been tracking the peacekeeping forces for 6 days now, ever since his network of informants had reported the humanitarian convoy's preparation. The irony wasn't lost on him. 47 people rushing to deliver medical supplies to villages that might not have needed help if the peacekeepers hadn't destabilized the region in the first place. His family had lived in one of those villages, his wife Aida, his daughter Camilla, who had just turned 7 and was learning to read, his son Beksat, who wanted to be a wildlife tracker like his father. They had been visiting Aida's sister when the airstrike came, a precision engagement, targeting suspected weapons storage, according to the official report. The weapons had turned out to be agricultural supplies and winter clothing for displaced families.
The thought brought its own grim satisfaction. He had been hunting amateurs for too long. The prospect of facing someone who might actually challenge his skills added a dimension to the mission that mere revenge couldn't provide. Altai's camera showed the convoy beginning to move, dust clouds rising as 12 vehicles started their journey into his carefully prepared kill zone. Beck settled into his final firing position, his body becoming one with the weapon as he began the meditation that would carry him through the next several hours. Somewhere down there, 47 people were driving toward their deaths, confident in their mission and their protective escort. Among them, perhaps, was a sniper who might actually understand what was about to happen. It would be interesting to see which of them was better prepared for what was coming. The hunt had begun. The pre-dawn air carried the bite of altitude and the promise of violence as Mara, Ortiz, and Aisha made their way through the maze of granite outcroppings that dotted the mountainside above the convoy route. Each potential firing position told its own story of angles, exposure, and tactical compromise, and Mara rejected them all with the methodical precision of someone solving an equation that only had one correct answer. "What about there?" Ortiz pointed to a natural depression between two boulder formations, about 1,500 meters from the road. "Good concealment, decent range, multiple escape routes." Mara studied the position for 30 seconds, then shook her head. "Wind tunnel. See how the rock faces create a Venturi effect? Any shot from there would be deflected by at least 2 meters at range." Aisha watched this exchange with growing fascination. In 3 weeks of working with the unit, she had never seen anyone analyze terrain with this level of detail. Most snipers looked for obvious advantages: elevation, concealment, clear lines of sight. Mara seemed to be calculating variables that existed in dimensions other soldiers couldn't even perceive. "What about there?" Ortiz pointed to a natural depression between two boulder formations, about 1,500 meters from the road. "Good concealment, decent range, multiple escape routes." Mara studied the position for 30 seconds, then shook her head. "Wind tunnel. See how the rock faces create a Venturi effect? Any shot from there would be deflected by at least 2 meters at range." Aisha watched this exchange with growing fascination. In 3 weeks of working with the unit, she had never seen anyone analyze terrain with this level of detail. Most snipers look for obvious advantages: elevation, concealment, clear lines of sight. Mara seemed to be calculating variables that existed in dimensions other soldiers couldn't even perceive. "Here, then," Ortiz tried again, indicating a ridgeline that offered commanding views of the entire valley. "Textbook Overwatch position." "Too textbook," Mara replied, her eyes already moving to scan other possibilities. "That's exactly where their counter-sniper teams will be watching. Besides, the angle is wrong for the distances we're dealing with." "What distances are we dealing with?" Aisha asked. Mara pulled out a small digital rangefinder and spent several minutes taking measurements to various points along the convoy route. "Best case scenario, 2,800 meters. Worst case," she paused, calculating, 4,200 meters, depending on where the Falconer positions himself. Ortiz nearly dropped his water bottle. 4,200? Mara, that's not a sniper shot, that's artillery range. "Artillery can't thread a needle," she replied, pulling out a topographical map that looked like it had been annotated by someone with an advanced degree in applied mathematics. Red marks indicated wind measurement points. Blue marks showed elevation changes. Green marks tracked what appeared to be acoustic reflection patterns. Aisha moved closer to study the map. "Lieutenant, what are all these calculations?" "Wind patterns," Mara said, pointing to a series of numbers written in microscopic handwriting along the ridgelines. "The prevailing winds in this valley follow predictable patterns, but they're affected by thermal columns that rise from different rock formations at different times of day. Temperature differentials create microclimates that can shift a bullet's trajectory by several meters at extreme range." "How do you know all this?" "I've been studying this region for 6 months. Weather data, geological surveys, historical wind patterns recorded by Soviet meteorological stations during the Cold War." Mara folded the map and continued walking. "Most snipers think about wind as a single variable, but wind is actually dozens of variables interacting with each other in 3-dimensional space." They spent the next hour climbing higher, rejecting position after position as Mara found fault with each one. Too exposed to return fire, too close to escape routes the enemy would monitor, too reliant on atmospheric conditions that could change without warning. Finally, as they crested a particularly treacherous slope of loose shale and exposed granite, Mara stopped. Her attention was fixed on something that looked like a pile of rubble about 300 meters above them, perched on what appeared to be a nearly vertical rock face. "There," she said quietly. Ortiz followed her gaze and laughed. "Mara, that's not a firing position. That's barely a place you could survive for 5 minutes." "Cold War observation post," she said, studying the structure through binoculars. Built by Soviet engineers in 1962, abandoned after the border treaty of 1969. Reinforced concrete construction designed to withstand artillery bombardment. Elevation of 3,100 meters above sea level, which puts it 4,700 meters from the optimal ambush point on the convoy route. Aisha felt her stomach drop. 4,700 meters? That's impossible. Theoretically impossible, but the Falconer won't expect anyone to attempt it, which means he won't position counter-snipers to watch for it, and the elevation advantage compensates for some of the atmospheric variables that make extreme-range shooting so difficult. Ortiz was studying the climb to the observation post through his own binoculars. Even if we could make that shot, and I'm not saying we could, how the hell do we get up there? That's basically a vertical climb with full gear.
Math, Aisha said suddenly. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her face flush. Sorry, sir, but I've been watching her preparation methods. She calculates trajectory corrections manually, using atmospheric data she's collected over months of observation. Her shooting logs show Mara was already opening her pack, revealing climbing equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue. Ascenders, carabiners, and specialized anchoring gear that looked like it belonged to someone who climbed mountains for reasons other than military necessity. I may have done some research on access routes, she said. Research, Aisha repeated. When did you do this research? Every night for the past month. There's a climbing route established by Soviet construction crews in 1962. It's not in any current military database, but the original engineering surveys are available if you know where to look. Ortiz was beginning to understand the scope of what Mara had been planning. You've been preparing for this specific mission for a month? Before we even knew about the convoy? I've been preparing for a mission like this since I joined the unit. The convoy just gave me a reason to use the preparation. As they began the technical climb toward the observation post, Aisha found herself watching Mara with a new kind of respect. Every hand placement was deliberate. Every foothold was tested before she committed her weight to it. Even her breathing followed a pattern that seemed designed to minimize exertion and maximize control. This is what luck looks like, Aisha whispered to herself. What? Ortiz called from below. Nothing, she replied, but her mind was racing. For weeks, she had listened to the stories about lucky Kovalenko and her impossible survival instincts. Now she was beginning to understand that luck had nothing to do with it. This was preparation on a scale that bordered on obsession, combined with a level of technical skill that most soldiers couldn't achieve if they trained for their entire careers. As they climbed higher, Aisha began to notice other details. The way Mara positioned herself to have multiple anchor points at all times. How she automatically tested the stability of every rock before using it for support. The fact that she seemed to anticipate wind gusts and equipment failures before they happened. This wasn't luck. This was someone who had trained herself to see 3 moves ahead in a game where most people couldn't even understand the rules. The command tent buzzed with the controlled chaos of a mission entering its final phase. Maps covered every available surface, communication equipment crackled with updates from reconnaissance teams, and the air was thick with tension and the smell of too much coffee consumed by people who hadn't slept enough. Captain Rutherford stood before a large-scale topographical display, his face a study in barely controlled frustration. Major, with all due respect, what Lieutenant Kovalenko is proposing isn't tactical innovation, it's suicide with extra steps. Major Suleimanova studied the climbing route that Mara had marked on the map, her expression unreadable. The path to the Cold War observation post looked like something designed by engineers who valued strategic advantage over human survival. Explain your concerns, Captain. Where do I begin? Rutherford pointed to the elevation markers. First, the climb itself, 80-degree incline over 300 meters of loose rock and exposed granite. One equipment failure, one shifted anchor point, and we lose our entire sniper team. "We've tested the route," Mara said quietly. "It's challenging, but manageable with proper equipment and technique." "Tested when? This is the first time you've mentioned this position." "Last month, off-duty reconnaissance." Rutherford turned to stare at her. "You climbed to an abandoned Soviet observation post during your off-duty time? Without authorization? Without backup?" "I wanted to verify the feasibility before proposing it for operational use." "That's—" Rutherford struggled for words. "That's either remarkable initiative or a serious breach of safety protocol. I'm not sure which." Suleimanova intervened before the argument could escalate. "Continue with your concerns, Captain." "Even assuming they survive the climb, the firing position itself is completely exposed. No cover from return fire, no concealment from aerial reconnaissance. If the enemy locates them, they're sitting ducks." "The position is 4,700 meters from the convoy route, beyond effective range for any weapon system the opposition is known to possess. And barely within effective range for ours," Rutherford countered. "At that distance, you're not just fighting wind and elevation, you're fighting the curvature of the Earth itself, atmospheric conditions that change by the second, variables that no ballistic computer can accurately predict." Ortiz spoke up from his position near the communications array. "Sir, I've been spotting for Lieutenant Kovalenko for 8 months. She doesn't rely on ballistic computers." "Oh? What does she rely on? Divine intervention?"
"Math," Aisha said suddenly. All eyes turned to her, and she felt her face flush. "Sorry, sir, but I've been watching her preparation methods. She calculates trajectory corrections manually, using atmospheric data she's collected over months of observation. Her shooting logs show Mara was already opening her pack, revealing climbing equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue. Ascenders, carabiners, and specialized anchoring gear that looked like it belonged to someone who climbed mountains for reasons other than military necessity. "I may have done some research on access routes," she said. "Research?" Aisha repeated. "When did you do this research?" "Every night for the past month. There's a climbing route established by Soviet construction crews in 1962. It's not in any current military database, but the original engineering surveys are available if you know where to look." Ortiz was beginning to understand the scope of what Mara had been planning. "You've been preparing for this specific mission for a month? Before we even knew about the convoy?" "I've been preparing for a mission like this since I joined the unit. The convoy just gave me a reason to use the preparation." As they began the technical climb toward the observation post, Aisha found herself watching Mara with a new kind of respect. Every hand placement was deliberate. Every foothold was tested before she committed her weight to it. Even her breathing followed a pattern that seemed designed to minimize exertion and maximize control. "This is what luck looks like," Aisha whispered to herself. "What?" Ortiz called from below. "Nothing," she replied, but her mind was racing. For weeks, she had listened to the stories about lucky Kovalenko and her impossible survival instincts. Now she was beginning to understand that luck had nothing to do with it. This was preparation on a scale that bordered on obsession, combined with a level of technical skill that most soldiers couldn't achieve if they trained for their entire careers. As they climbed higher, Aisha began to notice other details. The way Mara positioned herself to have multiple anchor points at all times. How she automatically tested the stability of every rock before using it for support. The fact that she seemed to anticipate wind gusts and equipment failures before they happened. This wasn't luck. This was someone who had trained herself to see 3 moves ahead in a game where most people couldn't even understand the rules. The command tent buzzed with the controlled chaos of a mission entering its final phase. Maps covered every available surface, communication equipment crackled with updates from reconnaissance teams, and the air was thick with tension and the smell of too much coffee consumed by people who hadn't slept enough. Captain Rutherford stood before a large-scale topographical display,
his face a study in barely controlled frustration. "Major, with all due respect, what Lieutenant Kovalenko is proposing isn't tactical innovation, it's suicide with extra steps." Major Suleimanova studied the climbing route that Mara had marked on the map, her expression unreadable. The path to the Cold War observation post looked like something designed by engineers who valued strategic advantage over human survival. "Explain your concerns, Captain." "Where do I begin?" Rutherford pointed to the elevation markers. "First, the climb itself. 80-degree incline over 300 meters of loose rock and exposed granite. One equipment failure, one shifted anchor point, and we lose our entire sniper team." "We've tested the route," Mara said quietly. "It's challenging, but manageable with proper equipment and technique." "Tested when? This is the first time you've mentioned this position." "Last month, off-duty reconnaissance." Rutherford turned to stare at her. "You climbed to an abandoned Soviet observation post during your off-duty time? Without authorization? Without backup?" "I wanted to verify the feasibility before proposing it for operational use." "That's—" Rutherford struggled for words. "That's either remarkable initiative or a serious breach of safety protocol. I'm not sure which." Suleimanova intervened before the argument could escalate. "Continue with your concerns, Captain." "Even assuming they survive the climb, the firing position itself is completely exposed. No cover from return fire, no concealment from aerial reconnaissance. If the enemy locates them, they're sitting ducks." "The position is 4,700 meters from the convoy route, beyond effective range for any weapon system the opposition is known to possess. And barely within effective range for ours," Rutherford countered. "At that distance, you're not just fighting wind and elevation, you're fighting the curvature of the Earth itself, atmospheric conditions that change by the second, variables that no ballistic computer can accurately predict." Ortiz spoke up from his position near the communications array. "Sir, I've been spotting for Lieutenant Kovalenko for 8 months. She doesn't rely on ballistic computers." "Oh? What does she rely on? Divine intervention?"
Abilities that exceed anything I've seen in the literature. Rutherford pulled out a tactical calculator and began running numbers. At 4,700 meters, with estimated wind conditions, the bullet drop alone would be— He paused, checking his calculations. Nearly 40 meters. Wind drift had pushed the projectile another 15 meters off target. You're talking about a shot that requires corrections so precise that a 1-degree error in elevation would mean missing by the length of a football field. "Yes, sir," Mara agreed. "And you believe you can make those corrections?" "I know I can." The confidence in her voice was absolute, and it stopped the argument cold. Rutherford studied her face, looking for any trace of doubt or bravado. Instead, he found the quiet certainty of someone stating a mathematical fact. "The logistics alone are problematic," he said finally, shifting to more practical concerns. "Getting equipment to that position, maintaining communications, coordinating with convoy security, and if something goes wrong, extraction becomes nearly impossible." "I've prepared for those contingencies," Mara replied, producing a detailed equipment list from her pack. "Lightweight gear, redundant communication systems, and pre-positioned rappelling anchors for emergency extraction." Suleimanova examined the list with the eye of someone who had planned dozens of similar operations. "This is thorough, perhaps overly so. Better to over-prepare than to fail because of something I didn't consider." "And if you miss?" Rutherford asked bluntly. "If all this preparation and all this risk results in a miss, what then? The convoy is still exposed, the enemy is still in position, and you're stranded on a mountainside with no backup plan." Mara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried undertones that none of them had heard before. "I won't miss. Lieutenant, I won't miss," she repeated, and this time there was something in her tone that made even Rutherford stop arguing. "I've been preparing for this shot my entire career.
Not this specific shot, but shots like it, shots that exist at the edge of what's possible. I've calculated every variable, compensated for every contingency, planned for every failure mode. I won't miss. Suleimanova studied the younger woman with the focused attention of someone recognizing something familiar. Your father used to say the same thing. Ma'am? Before impossible shots, before missions that everyone else said couldn't be done, I won't miss. And he never did. The major turned to address the room. The convoy departs in 18 hours. Lieutenant Kovalenko, Sergeant Ortiz, and Private Rahman will establish overwatch from the observation post. Captain Rutherford, coordinate your security teams to cover the conventional approach routes. Questions? Rutherford's objection was immediate. Major, I strongly recommend... Recommendation noted and dismissed. Suleimanova's tone carried the finality of an avalanche. The decision is made. As the briefing broke up, Rutherford approached Mara privately. Lieutenant, I hope you understand what you're committing to. If this goes wrong, it doesn't just mean mission failure. It means 47 people die, and the responsibility for that will rest on your shoulders. Mara met his gaze without flinching. Sir, if I don't take this shot, 47 people die anyway. The only difference is whether we at least try to do something about it. After he left, Suleimanova lingered behind. Kovalenko, a word. They stepped outside the tent, where the cold air carried the scent of snow and the distant rumble of aircraft returning to base. I need to know something, the major said. This shot you're planning, is it really possible, or are you letting pride override judgment? Mara considered the question with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. It's possible. Barely, but possible. The variables are enormous. The margin for error is essentially zero, and a dozen things could go wrong. But if all the calculations are correct, if the conditions hold, if everything works exactly as planned, it's possible. And if it's not, if some variable you haven't accounted for throws off your calculations, then 47 people die, Mara said simply. But they die whether I take the shot or not. At least this way, they have a chance. Suleimanova nodded slowly. Your father would be proud. As Mara walked away to begin her final preparations, she wondered if that was true. Alexei Kovalenko had been a legend among Soviet marksmen, a man whose impossible shots had passed into military folklore. But he had also been a man who understood the weight of responsibility that came with extraordinary skill. Tomorrow, she would find out if she had inherited more than just his eye for angles and his steady hands. She would find out if she had inherited the ability to carry the weight of other people's lives on the tip of a bullet fired across impossible distance. The mathematics of it made her head hurt, but the moral calculus was surprisingly simple. 47 people were counting on her, whether they knew it or not. She wouldn't let them down. At 0347 hours, while the convoy was still conducting final equipment checks 40 kilometers away, Mara rappelled from her initial anchor point into a wind that could freeze exposed skin in minutes and kill the unwary in less than an hour. The Cold War observation post loomed above them like a concrete monument to paranoia and engineering hubris, and every meter of the climb toward it was a reminder that Soviet military planners valued strategic advantage over human comfort.
Gear check, Mara called softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Ortiz secured his climbing pack and tested his radio connection. Spotting scope, rangefinder, comm equipment, all secure. Though I still think we're insane for attempting this. Aisha double-checked her gear loadout, trying to ignore the fact that they were essentially climbing a vertical rock face in the dark while carrying enough equipment to outfit a small army. Reconnaissance gear functional, backup communication systems tested, emergency medical supplies secured. Climbing gear, Mara announced, running through her equipment check with the methodical precision of someone who understood that a single overlooked detail could kill all three of them. Primary rope,
backup rope, anchoring systems, ascenders, emergency rappelling gear, weather protection, emergency shelter, 72 hours of supplies. She had been awake for 36 hours straight, but her movements showed no sign of fatigue. Every hand placement was deliberate, every foothold tested, every anchor point secured with triple redundancy. This was someone who had turned preparation into an art form and paranoia into a survival skill. The first 100 meters of the climb were the most technically challenging. The Soviet engineers had blasted handholds into the granite face, but 40 years of weather had made many of them unreliable. Worse, the route was exposed to winds that funneled through the mountain passes with enough force to tear unwary climbers from the rock face. "Hold position," Mara called as a gust of wind strong enough to move boulders screamed past them. She pressed herself against the rock and waited, counting seconds until the wind pattern shifted to something more manageable. Ortiz, secured 20 meters below her, watched her technique with growing admiration. Most climbers fought the mountain, using strength and equipment to force their way upward. Mara seemed to flow with the natural patterns of the rock face, finding handholds that appeared impossible until you understood the subtle geometry of the granite formation. "How did you learn to climb like this?" Aisha called from her position at the bottom of the current pitch. "My father," Mara replied, setting a new anchor point with practice efficiency. "He used to say that mountains don't care about your schedule or your mission objectives. They follow their own rules, and you either learn those rules or you die." The second 100 meters were worse. The route traversed the series of ledges that required precise timing to navigate safely. Too fast, and you'd miss critical handholds. Too slow, and exposure to the wind would sap your strength until simple tasks became impossible. Halfway across the most exposed traverse, disaster struck. Ortiz was following Mara's route, moving carefully from one anchor point to the next when the rope anchor above him shifted. Not catastrophically, just enough to change the angle of the rope and throw off his balance as he reached for the next handhold. His feet slipped on the ice-slicked granite. For a moment that lasted forever, he hung suspended over 400 meters of empty air, his weight supported only by a single mechanical ascender that was designed for controlled climbing, not sudden dynamic loads. The ascender held, but the anchor point above him, a piece of Soviet-era hardware that had been corroding for 40 years, began to fail. Mara reacted before her conscious mind had fully processed what was happening. She drove a new anchor point into the rock face with 3 quick blows of her climbing hammer, clipped her safety line to it, and rappelled down toward Ortiz's position faster than safety protocols would ever recommend. "Don't move," she called to him. "The anchor is failing, but slowly. I can get to you." "Mara, no! If that anchor fails while you're connected to it—" "It won't fail." Her voice carried absolute certainty. "The metal fatigue patterns show it can support static weight for another 10 minutes. Dynamic loading would fail it immediately, but static weight it can handle." "How can you possibly know that?" "Because I've been studying Soviet construction standards for 6 months, and I can see the stress fractures in the metal from here." She reached him with 30 seconds to spare, securing a new safety line and transferring his weight to a fresh anchor point just as the original hardware finally surrendered to 40 decades of mountain weather. "That," Ortiz said as they resumed climbing, "was the most terrifying and impressive thing I've ever seen." "Just good planning," Mara replied, but Aisha could hear something different in her voice. For the first time since she'd known her, Lieutenant Lucky Kovalenko sounded almost human. The final section of the climb was a chimney formation that required them to brace between 2 rock walls and work their way upward using leg and back pressure. It was exhausting work at sea level. At over 3,000 meters of elevation, it was brutal. But finally, as the first traces of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, they hauled themselves onto the concrete platform of the observation post. The structure was smaller than it had appeared from below. Just a reinforced concrete shell with narrow observation slits and mounting points for equipment that had been removed decades ago. But it was solid, defensible, and positioned exactly where Mara's calculations had indicated it needed to be. "Range to primary engagement area?" Ortiz asked, setting up his spotting scope.
Mara deployed a laser rangefinder and began taking measurements. 4,683 meters to the optimal ambush point, 4,712 meters to the convoy's most likely position when the Falconer makes his move. Wind? Variable, gusting to 25 kilometers per hour, but the wind patterns are following the predictions. Mara consulted her handwritten atmospheric data. Temperature inversion at 2,200 meters is creating a thermal layer that should stabilize conditions for approximately 4 hours. Aisha was setting up the communication equipment when movement in the valley below caught her attention. "Lieutenant, I've got visual contact with convoy vehicles staging at Checkpoint Alpha." Mara raised her binoculars and studied the distant specks that represented 12 trucks and 47 lives. At this range, they looked like toys arranged on a sand table. In 6 hours, she would be shooting across the space between them with a precision that demanded perfection. "Convoy is on schedule," she reported into her radio. "Overwatch team in position and ready." The response crackled back immediately. "Copy Echo 7. Weather conditions holding steady. You are cleared for autonomous engagement." As they settled into their final positions, Mara felt the familiar calm that came with preparation meeting opportunity. Every variable had been calculated, every contingency planned for, every piece of equipment tested and retested. Somewhere in the valley below, the Falconer was making his own preparations, setting his own trap with the same methodical precision she had brought to this mission. In a few hours, they would find out which of them had prepared better. The hunt was about to begin. Through the Schmidt and Bender scope mounted on Whisper, Mara watched the valley below transform from a peaceful mountain landscape into a carefully orchestrated killing field. The convoy had been moving for 2 hours, 12 vehicles strung out along the dusty road like beads on a string, unaware that they were being watched by 2 different sets of eyes from 2 impossible positions. "Movement, 2 o'clock, Ortiz reported quietly, his spotting scope trained on a ridgeline 3,500 meters to the northeast. "Thermal bloom consistent with human presence, but I can't get a positive identification." Mara shifted her attention to the indicated position, her mind automatically calculating angles and possibilities. Too close to the convoy route. If the Falconer is there, he's either using a forward observer or is not as smart as his reputation suggests. Maybe he's not as smart as his reputation suggests. Or maybe that's exactly what he wants us to think. She had been studying the terrain for 4 hours now, mapping every possible firing position, every potential hide site, every location that offered the combination of range, concealment, and escape routes that a sniper of the Falconer's caliber would require. The conventional positions were all obvious: ridge lines with clear sight lines to the convoy route, elevated positions that offered tactical advantages that any military manual would recommend. But the Falconer hadn't survived 18 months of hunting peacekeepers by following military manuals. "There," she said suddenly, her scope settling on a position that shouldn't have been viable for long-range shooting. "Grid reference 347892, range 4,100 meters." Ortiz swung his spotting scope to match her aim point. "I don't see anything." "Look for what's not there. Thermal shadows that don't match the surrounding terrain, vegetation patterns that are too regular, light reflection from surfaces that should be matte." It took him several minutes of careful observation before he saw it. A slight distortion in the natural patterns of the mountainside, so subtle that it would be invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. "Son of a bitch," he breathed. "How did you spot that?" "Because it's exactly where I would position myself if I were him." Mara's voice carried grim admiration. "Perfect sight lines to the convoy route, elevation advantage for ballistic calculations, natural wind breaks to minimize atmospheric interference, and far enough away that conventional counter-sniper doctrine says it's impossible to engage from." 4,100 meters, Aisha said, checking the numbers on her range-finding equipment. "That's beyond the effective range of any rifle system we have intelligence on." "It's beyond the effective range of standard rifle systems," Mara corrected. "But the Falconer doesn't use standard equipment any more than we do." She began the final sequence of calculations that would determine whether the next few minutes resulted in 47 people continuing their journey home or 47 families receiving folded flags and carefully worded condolences.
Wind speed at her position, 15 kilometers per hour, gusting to 22 kilometers per hour. Wind speed at target, estimated 18 to 25, based on vegetation movement visible through her scope. Temperature differential between firing position and target, approximately 12 degrees Celsius. Convoy is approaching optimal engagement range, Ortiz reported. Lead vehicle will be in the Falconer's prime firing zone in approximately 4 minutes. Mara's fingers moved across Whisper's custom turrets, dialing in corrections that existed at the very edge of what physics would allow. Elevation, 43 minutes of angle. Windage, 37 minutes of angle, with an additional correction for the Coriolis effect that would deflect her bullet nearly 2 meters to the right at this range. "Contact," Aisha announced suddenly, her voice tight with tension. "I've got visual confirmation of target. Male, camouflaged, rifle mounted on a bipod system. Range 4,100 meters, bearing 047 degrees.
Through her scope, Mara could see him now, a figure so perfectly camouflaged that he appeared to be part of the mountainside itself. His rifle was a work of art, a custom-built system that looked like it had been designed specifically for the kind of shooting that existed only in theoretical discussions and sniper folklore. "He's tracking the convoy," Ortiz observed. "Scope is following the lead vehicle's movement pattern." Mara watched the distant figure with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. The Falconer's positioning was perfect, his camouflage was flawless, and his rifle was trained on a target that would be in optimal range in less than 3 minutes. But he had made one critical error. He had assumed that no one else would attempt a shot from a position that violated every principle of conventional marksmanship doctrine. "Wind conditions are stabilizing," she reported, feeling the mountain air currents settle into the patterns she had been studying for months. "Thermal column from the valley floor is creating a consistent updraft. Atmospheric pressure is holding steady." Her breathing slowed, following the rhythm she had practiced 10,000 times in training and real-world engagements. Heartbeat steady at 68 beats per minute. Muscle tension reduced to the minimal necessary to maintain weapon control, mental state focused to the singular point where mathematics met instinct and preparation met opportunity. Convoy lead vehicle entering primary engagement zone, 2 minutes to optimal firing position. The Falconer's scope tracked smoothly across the valley, following the convoy's progress with mechanical precision. Mara could see his form settle into final firing position, every line of his body speaking to years of training and dozens of successful kills. "He's preparing to fire," Aisha whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow alert their target across 4 kilometers of empty mountain air. Mara's crosshairs settled on a point in space that her calculations insisted was exactly where the Falconer's center of mass would be when she pulled the trigger. At this range, the bullet would spend nearly 6 seconds in flight, crossing wind zones and atmospheric layers that would push and pull it in ways that no computer could perfectly predict. But Mara had been preparing for this shot her entire career, and every variable had been accounted for, every contingency planned, and every possible failure mode addressed. Her finger found the trigger, applying the precise 3 pounds of pressure that would release a bullet into a mathematical dance with physics, probability, and the curvature of the Earth itself. "Firing," she announced quietly. The rifle's recoil was absorbed by her body position and the bipod system, but she kept her eye on the scope, watching the trace of her bullet's path across the impossible distance that separated her from her target. 4,700 meters away, the Falconer's rifle was swinging toward its final aim point when Mara's bullet arrived. Time dilated in the seconds following Mara's trigger pull, each moment stretching like light bent around a massive star. Through her scope, she tracked the invisible path of her bullet as it carved through 4 kilometers of mountain air, carrying with it the mathematical certainty of months of preparation and the moral weight of 47 lives.
The bullet flew through 3 distinct wind zones. First, the updraft from the valley floor that would lift it slightly above her calculated trajectory. Second, the crosswind at 2,800 meters that threatened to push it toward the granite face of the opposing ridge. Third, the downdraft where the mountain peaks created a Venturi effect that could slam the projectile into the ground 50 meters short of its target. But Mara had calculated for all of this. At 3,400 meters, the bullet passed through a thermal layer where temperature differentials could alter its ballistic coefficient by 2%. At 3,800 meters, the Coriolis effect reached its maximum influence, deflecting the projectile nearly 2 meters to the right of its original path. She had calculated for this, too. "Impact in 2 seconds," Ortiz whispered, his spotting scope trained on the Falconer's position. Across the valley, the distant figure was settling into his final firing position, his rifle swinging toward the convoy's lead vehicle with mechanical precision. His finger was likely taking up trigger pressure, preparing to send his own bullet on a journey that would end 47 lives and advance whatever cause he served. Mara's bullet arrived first. The impact was visible through her scope as a brief disruption in the target's silhouette, followed by the unmistakable collapse of a human form. At this range, there was no sound, no dramatic explosion, just the sudden cessation of movement from a figure who had been preparing to kill. "Target down," she announced quietly into a radio. The confirmation came back immediately from observation teams positioned throughout the valley. "Confirmed. Hostile sniper eliminated. Convoy is clear to proceed." Aisha let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Holy shit, Lieutenant! You actually did it!" Language private, but her attention was already shifting to potential secondary threats. The Falconer's reputation suggested he worked alone, but military doctrine demanded verification. "Movement in Sector 7, Ortiz reported, tracking new thermal signatures through his spotting scope. "Looks like at least 3 individuals evacuating the primary hide site. Looks like at least 3 individuals." "Spotters," Mara said, already calculating new firing solutions. "The Falconer may be down, but his support team is still operational." She tracked the fleeing figures through her scope, noting their movement patterns and escape routes. Professional soldiers would have held position to confirm their sniper status. These individuals were running, which suggested they understood exactly what had happened and wanted no part of a counter-sniper engagement. "Let him go," came the radio call from Major Suleimanova. "Priority is convoy security. Do not engage secondary targets unless they pose immediate threat." Mara acknowledged the order, but kept her rifle trained on the distant mountainside until the last of the thermal signatures disappeared into the maze of granite formations that dominated the region. Only then did she allow herself to truly process what had just occurred.
She had made a shot that existed at the very edge of what physics allowed, across a distance that conventional military doctrine considered impossible, under conditions that required mathematical precision so exact that a single miscalculation would have meant failure. And she had done it, not for glory or recognition, but to protect people she would never meet, who would never know her name or understand what had almost happened to them on a dusty mountain road in Kazakhstan. "Convoy clear of danger zone," Aisha reported, monitoring radio traffic from the vehicles below. "All personnel accounted for, mission successful." Ortiz was studying Mara's face through his binoculars, looking for some sign of satisfaction or relief. Instead, he found the same calm professionalism she brought to routine training exercises. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," she replied, beginning the methodical process of cleaning and securing her weapon. "And hungry. We've been up here for 8 hours. "That's it? You just made the shot of the century and you're hungry?" Mara paused in her work, considering the question with characteristic deliberation. It was a good shot, but it was also just the logical result of proper preparation meeting favorable conditions. The mathematics worked out exactly as predicted. The mathematics, Aisha repeated. Right, because that's what this was about. That's exactly what this was about. Mara's voice carried no trace of false modesty. Preparation, calculation, and execution. Everything else is just stories people tell themselves. But as they began the careful process of rappelling down from the observation post, Mara found herself thinking about her father and the impossible shots that had made him a legend among Soviet marksmen. She wondered if he had felt this same mixture of satisfaction and emptiness after making kills that saved lives but revealed capabilities that were better kept hidden. The mathematics had indeed worked out exactly as predicted, but mathematics couldn't account for what came next. 3 weeks after the convoy incident, Mara sat in Major Suleimanova's office, staring at a classified intelligence briefing that made her stomach tighten with familiar dread. Satellite imagery showed movement in the mountains north of our position, small groups of armed individuals establishing observation posts and supply caches in areas that had been vacant for months. "They're looking for you," Suleimanova said without preamble. "The Falconer may be dead, but his network is still operational, and they know that someone made a shot that shouldn't have been possible." Captain Rutherford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Since the mission, his attitude toward Mara had evolved from skepticism to grudging respect to something approaching concern. "The intelligence suggests they've identified the general area where the shot originated. It's only a matter of time before they narrow it down to specific firing positions." "Which means it's only a matter of time before they identify the shooter," Suleimanova added. "Your anonymity was your greatest protection, Lieutenant. That protection no longer exists." Mara studied the satellite images with the same methodical attention she brought to everything else. The movement patterns suggested a coordinated search effort, with multiple teams working to triangulate the fire-in position based on ballistic evidence and witness statements from the Falconer's surviving associates. "Recommendations?" Mara asked. "Transfer. New unit, new theater of operations, new identity if necessary. Put as much distance as possible between you and this region." "That's one option," Suleimanova agreed. "But it's also an admission that extraordinary capability comes with unacceptable risk. If we transfer every soldier who demonstrates exceptional skill, we end up with units full of mediocrity. And if we don't, we end up with exceptional soldiers who become targets for every extremist group in Central Asia," Rutherford countered. The debate continued for 20 minutes, but Mara's attention had shifted to a different concern. Through the office window, she could see Aisha conducting rifle training with a group of new recruits. The young private had been different since the mission, more focused, more demanding of herself and others, more aware of the details that separated competent soldiers from exceptional ones. "There's another consideration," Mara said finally. "Private Rockman has been documenting my training methods. Not officially, but I've seen her notes. She's trying to understand the preparation that makes extreme-range shooting possible." Suleimanova raised an eyebrow. "And how do you feel about that?" "Conflicted. On one hand, sharing knowledge makes the entire unit more capable. On the other hand, some capabilities are dangerous in the wrong hands." "Or dangerous in any hands," Rutherford added. "The shot you made has already generated interest from multiple intelligence agencies. There are people who would very much like to understand how it was accomplished." Mara nodded slowly. She had expected this conversation since the moment she pulled the trigger on the observation post. Extraordinary capability,
always came with extraordinary scrutiny, and anonymity was a luxury that disappeared the moment you demonstrated skills that existed outside normal parameters.
"What if we approach this differently?" she said. "Instead of hiding exceptional capability, what if we use it to train others? Not to the same level that would take years and very specific aptitudes, but to a level that makes the entire unit more effective." Explain? "Aisha has the foundation to become an exceptional marksman. So do several others in the unit. Instead of transferring me away from the threat, we acknowledge that the threat exists and prepare more people to deal with it." Suleimanova considered this proposal with the calculating attention of someone who had been making strategic decisions for 3 decades. "You're suggesting that we create more targets instead of protecting the one we have? I'm suggesting that we create more capabilities instead of losing the one we have." The discussion was interrupted by a soft knock on the office door. Aisha entered, carrying a sealed envelope marked with the distinctive red striping that indicated priority intelligence traffic. "Ma'am, this just came in from Signals Intelligence. Priority designation for Lieutenant Kovalenko." Mara opened the envelope and read its contents twice before speaking. "Intercepted communications suggest the Falconer's network has identified our general operational area. They're offering a substantial bounty for information leading to the identification of the sniper responsible for his death." "How substantial?" Rutherford asked. "Substantial enough to motivate a lot of people who wouldn't normally involve themselves in military operations." Suleimanova stood and walked to the window, studying the mountain ranges that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "Then we have a decision to make. We can preserve one exceptional soldier by removing her from the theater, or we can use her presence to draw out threats that would otherwise remain hidden." "Using her as a bait, you mean?" "Using her as an asset. There's a difference." Mara found herself thinking about her father again and the choices he had made when his own exceptional capabilities had attracted unwanted attention. According to family stories, he had chosen to continue serving despite the risks, believing that extraordinary skill came with extraordinary responsibility. "I'll stay. But I want to train others. If we're going to be targets, let's at least make sure we're not the only targets." The discussion was made without further discussion, but as Mara left the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just committed herself to a path that would fundamentally change everything about how she approached her work. Anonymity had been her greatest protection, and she had just given it up voluntarily. Now she would have to find new ways to survive in a world where her capabilities were known and her enemies had names and faces. The mathematics of survival had just become significantly more complex. 6 months later, the rifle range echoed with the precise cadence of controlled breathing and methodical trigger pulls as Mara worked with her small group of advanced students. The afternoon sun slanted through the mountain air, casting long shadows across the targets that had been positioned at distances most military units would consider excessive. "Breathing control isn't just about oxygen management," she told Private Rockman, who was preparing for a shot at 1,800 meters. "It's about creating a consistent physiological baseline that allows you to replicate the same firing conditions every time." Aisha nodded, settling into her firing position with the deliberate precision that had become her signature over the past months of intensive training. Her rifle was a modified version of Mara's own weapon, adapted for her smaller frame, but incorporating the same attention to detail that made extreme-range shooting possible. "Wind reading? 12 kilometers per hour at our position, gusting to 16. Target area showing consistent 15-kilometer crosswind based on vegetation movement. Temperature differential approximately 8 degrees Celsius. Atmospheric pressure? Holding steady at 987 millibars, no significant weather systems moving through the engagement area. Range and elevation corrections?" Aisha consulted her data book, a handwritten collection of ballistic information that she had been building with the same obsessive attention to detail that Mara had demonstrated. 1,837 meters to target, elevation correction 14 minutes of angle, windage correction 9 minutes of angle. Fire when ready. The shot was perfect.
a center mass hit on a target that would have challenged snipers with twice Aisha's experience. But more importantly, it was a shot that demonstrated understanding rather than luck, calculation rather than instinct.
Outstanding, Mara said. Now tell me what you would do differently if the range were 2,500 meters. As Aisha worked through the more complex mathematics, Mara found herself watching the mountains that surrounded their training area. Somewhere out there, the Falconer's network was still operational, still searching for the sniper who had ended their leader's career. Intelligence reports suggested they had narrowed their search considerably, and it was only a matter of time before the hunt came to her. But she was no longer the same person who had made the impossible shot from the Soviet observation post. This soldier was defined by legacy and shared knowledge. Lieutenant? Sergeant Ortiz approached from the range office, carrying another envelope marked with priority intelligence designations. Latest intel briefing. Mara read the report with practiced efficiency. Movement in Sector 12. Communications intercepts suggesting imminent action against peacekeeping personnel. Specific threats against sniper teams operating in the region. They're getting closer, Ortiz observed. Yes, Mara agreed, but so are we. She gestured toward the training range, where 4 soldiers were demonstrating shooting skills that would have been considered exceptional just 6 months earlier. Not at her level, that would take years to develop, but capable of shots that extended far beyond conventional military doctrine. When they come for me, she said, they're going to discover that they're not hunting one exceptional sniper, they're hunting a unit full of them. Is that enough? Mara considered the question while watching Aisha coach another student through the complex mathematics of extreme-range shooting. My father used to say that the most important shot a sniper ever takes isn't the one that saves lives, it's the one that teaches someone else how to save lives. Did he really say that? No, Mara admitted with a rare smile, but he should have. As the training session concluded and the soldiers began cleaning their weapons with the methodical precision that had become their signature, Mara reflected on the changes that had occurred since the convoy mission. She was no longer Lucky Kovalenko, the soldier whose impossible survival was attributed to chance and guardian spirits. She had become something more dangerous and more valuable, a teacher whose students carried her knowledge into situations she would never see. The envelope in her pocket contained transfer orders, an assignment to a new theater of operations where her skills would be needed and her notoriety would be less of a liability. She had not yet decided whether to accept them. In the distance, the cry of a hunting falcon echoed across the mountains, a reminder that the game of predator and prey continued regardless of human politics or military objectives. But Mara no longer worried about being hunted. She had taught others to hunt, and the mathematics of survival had shifted in her favor. The legend of Lucky Kovalenko would fade into military folklore, replaced by stories of soldiers whose impossible shots were attributed to superior training rather than supernatural intervention. But the knowledge would persist, passed from teacher to student, from one generation of warriors to the next. Some legacies were measured in kills confirmed than missions accomplished. Others were measured in knowledge preserved and capabilities shared. As the sun set behind the peaks of the Altai Mountains, Mara Kovalenko cleaned her rifle one final time and began planning lessons for soldiers who would carry her father's gift into battles she would never see. The mathematics of that legacy made her smile. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.